The sun dips low, yet one shadow lingers longer than it should. Welcome to Grey Whisper. I'm your host, Silas Drex. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your words make this mystery come alive. Let's begin. It was on a windless autumn afternoon in the year of our Lord, 1894, that I first became aware of the curious affair which would later be known, in hushed tones among certain corridors of power, as the shadow that stretched before sunset. I remember the day precisely, for the orange-gold sunlight filtered through the fog as though reluctant to touch the sooty cobblestones of Baker Street. And Holmes, never one to romanticize meteorological phenomena, had just declared it a sky that foretells something foul or foolish. I had entered our sitting room at 221B bearing a copy of the Times, fresh from the tobacconist's corner, and found Holmes stretched languidly across the divan, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed. To the lay observer, he might have appeared asleep. To me, however, his stillness was more alarming than motion. I knew that when Sherlock Holmes lay in silence, he was most often deep in the orchestration of logic's most delicate concertos. "What is it today, Holmes?" I asked, seating myself by the fire. "The Persian slipper, or the monograph on tobacco ash?" "Neither," came the reply, without so much as the flicker of an eyelid. "I am considering a shadow." "A shadow?" I echoed, lowering the paper. "A metaphorical one, I assume." Holmes opened his eyes and looked at me, his grey gaze alight with a strange intensity. "No, Watson, a very real shadow, one that falls across a man's life before the light of it is extinguished entirely." Before I could press him further, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door with a calling card upon a tray. Holmes took it delicately between his fingers and examined it with an inscrutable smile. Well, the Honourable Hugo Montreux. I wondered when the tide would reach my shore. I recognized the name instantly. Montreux was the youngest son of the Earl of Carmarthen, a family much whispered about in political and diplomatic circles. A recent scandal involving the elder Montreux brother had made the society columns and was now a regular fixture in private gentlemen's clubs. Allegations of embezzlement, a mysterious visit to Constantinople, and then a sudden withdrawal from public life altogether. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," said Holmes, rising and fastening the top button of his housecoat with the air of a man preparing for battle. The Honourable Hugo Montreux entered with that peculiar air possessed only by those born to privilege but taught too late that privilege may come with a price. He was young, no more than 35, but his eyes bore the weary polish of a man who had looked too long into uncertain depths. His gloves were immaculate, but his collar slightly rumpled, as though he had redressed himself in a hurry. "Mr. Holmes, I apologize for the intrusion," he began. "Nonsense." Holmes waved him into the armchair opposite the fire. "Any man who casts a shadow worth chasing is welcome at this hearth. You are in some distress." Montreux managed a tight smile. "That is an understatement." Holmes gestured toward me. "You may speak freely. Dr. Watson is my constant companion and a soul more trustworthy than most I have met." Montreux nodded, then leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands folded. "It's my brother, Mr. Holmes. Benedict Montreux. Or rather, what's left of him. Yesterday evening he was found dead in his study at Dunraven House. The official cause is presumed to be suicide." "A presumed suicide?" Holmes interjected softly, brows lifting a notch. "And what causes you to question the presumption?" Montreux hesitated. "Because of the shadow, Mr. Holmes." Watson shifted slightly, leaning forward. Holmes' fingers flexed. "Continue." "My brother had become increasingly reclusive these past months, refused callers, ceased all correspondence, even with me. Yet just days ago, he wrote me a letter, strange in tone, disjointed. But in it, he said he believed he was being followed, that someone or something was watching him." Holmes tilted his head. And then Montreux reached inside his coat and drew forth a sheet of cream-colored stationery, worn at the folds. Holmes took it and examined it with careful eyes. I caught only a portion of the handwriting, erratic, jagged, not at all the elegant script one expected from a gentleman. The shadow stretches farther each day, not from the sun, but from something darker. If I vanish, know it was not by my hand. Holmes handed the letter to me and began pacing slowly in front of the hearth. You say he was found yesterday? Yes, at sunset. By the butler, Hawtrey. The windows were open. A single candle burned on his desk. The door was locked from within. Any weapon found? A pistol, his own, in his hand. And no one else in the house. Only the housekeeper, a scullery maid, and Hawtrey. And yet, Holmes murmured, you do not believe he took his own life. Montreux's voice dropped. The body was cold, but the candle had barely melted. There were no powder marks on his sleeve. And, yes, there were footprints, muddy ones, leading to the window, but none leading away. Now Holmes stopped dead in his tracks. A locked room, a dead man with no powder burn, a final letter foretelling a shadow, and footprints that arrive, but do not leave. He turned to me with a spark behind his eyes. Watson, fetch your coat. We are going to Dunraven House before this shadow stretches any further. And with that, we stepped out into the gathering twilight of Baker Street, unaware that before the week's end, we would come face to face not merely with a murderer, but with a fear that had been cultivated, in silence and fed in secrecy, until it killed. The hansom cab rocked gently as it carried us westward through the fog-bound arteries of London, the dying light painting long shadows across gas-lit shop fronts and soot-smudged windows. Holmes sat opposite me in the cab, his hands resting lightly on the silver head of his cane, his profile cut sharp against the dim glow from the passing street lamps. His expression was neither contemplative nor aloof. It was alert, watching, listening, measuring something I had yet to perceive. Beside me, the Honorable Hugo Montreux shifted in his seat. The lines at his mouth had deepened since we left Baker Street, and he kept glancing down at his gloves as though half expecting them to vanish. Holmes broke the silence at last, his voice as calm and precise as a scalpel. Your brother's death occurred at Dunraven House, you said. That is the town house near the western edge of Kensington Gardens, is it not? Montreux nodded. Yes, a family property, though Benedict lived there alone these past 6 years. Holmes tapped his cane once against the floorboards. And the staff? Hawtrey has been with us since I was a boy. He's loyal, meticulous, former military. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bradmore, is new, joined only 6 months ago, and the maid, Elsie, barely speaks above a whisper. A local girl. Holmes gave no reply to this, but I knew the cogs were already turning. When he turned toward the window, I followed his gaze, but saw only the blurred lamps of the city rushing past and the creeping dusk that seemed to settle a little deeper with every block we passed. Holmes, I ventured, this letter, do you find it credible? There's something rather melodramatic about it. Holmes did not turn. It is not the language that interests me, Watson. It is the fact that the letter was written at all. Meaning? Most suicides leave apologies, not riddles. Montreux let out a slow breath and said, Benedict was a rational man. Harsh at times, but not mad. He would not have written such things without cause. Holmes nodded faintly. Quite. The remainder of the journey passed in silence, and soon enough the cab turned onto a narrow lane, lined with tall plane trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The brick facade of Dunraven House emerged through the mist, a grim and narrow structure with black iron railings, its windows shuttered like eyes in mourning. The place exhaled solitude. Hawtrey met us at the door. A man of rigid bearing and frost-grey hair, he nodded once at Montreux and then at us. recognizing authority, or perhaps simply the gravity Holmes brought with him like a second cloak. "This way, gentlemen." The interior of the house was dimly lit but immaculate. Not a speck of dust, not a thread out of place. The carpets muffled our steps as we climbed the curving staircase to the study on the first floor. Hawtrey stopped at the threshold. "No one has entered since the police completed their inspection this morning," he said quietly. "Though I replaced the candle. The old one had nearly burned out." Holmes offered a nod of thanks, then stepped into the study. I followed. It was a long, narrow room with tall windows overlooking a neglected garden. A heavy writing desk stood beneath one of them, and behind it, a high-backed leather chair, empty now. The air smelled faintly of ink, wax, and something else I could not immediately place. Something dry, metallic. Holmes moved with feline stillness. His eyes scanned the bookshelves, the half-burned candle on the desk, the drapes that hung stiffly to the floor. He paused before a dark stain on the carpet. "Here," he said softly. I stepped forward and followed his gaze. The stain, blood no doubt, was neatly positioned behind the desk. Just to the right of the chair, a pistol lay on the surface, next to a closed book and a silver letter opener. Holmes examined the weapon without touching it. "Recently cleaned," he murmured. "But look, Watson, your medical eye, if you please. If this weapon were fired at close range, where would you expect the powder burns?" "On the shirt sleeve, certainly. Perhaps the collar, depending on the angle. And yet the report says there were none. Curious." Holmes turned his attention to the windows. They were latched shut now, but the thin layer of dirt on the sill suggested recent movement. He bent closer, running a fingertip along the wood, and then suddenly crouched low. "Here," he said again. "Footprints." I saw them, just barely, impressions in the carpet pile. Not full prints, but enough to show the outline of a boot. Small, narrow, 3 steps toward the desk, but none leading away. "No rain last night," Holmes said to himself. "So where did the mud come from?" He crossed to the fireplace, where a small pile of ash and burnt paper lay undisturbed. With a flick of his cane, he scattered it gently, examining the fragments. "Montreux," he said over his shoulder. "Do you recognize this?" The younger man stepped forward. Holmes held up a sliver of partially burned parchment, its edge still bearing the faint remnants of a crimson wax seal. Montreux's brow furrowed. Yes, that's from my father's estate seal, our family correspondence. But I never sent a letter to Benedict recently." Holmes's eyes flashed. "But someone did." He crossed to the bookcase next, trailing a finger along the spines before selecting a single volume and drawing it out, Gibbon's Decline and Fall, Volume 2. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a folded note. Holmes read it swiftly and said nothing. He handed it to me. It was a single line, hastily written. "The shadow comes not after the man, but before him. At sunset, it swallows everything." "What the devil does that mean?" I muttered. Holmes said nothing at first, then moved to the edge of the study window and stood very still, watching the last sliver of sunlight as it disappeared behind the edge of a roofline. The angle was curious. At that hour, the light would stretch long across the desk, casting the shadow of anyone seated in the chair across the carpeted floor. "Watson," he said softly, "how many men cast shadows before they arrive?" None, I suppose." Holmes turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Exactly. But this killer did." And then, as though returning from some deep chamber of thought, he strode toward the door. "Hawtrey," he called down the stairwell. "Prepare the lower cellar. I want to see where the boots are stored. And send for Mrs. Bradmore and the maid. Dr. Watson and I will have a few questions." Montreux turned to him, visibly shaken. Do you think Benedict was right? That someone was following him?" Holmes looked at him, not unkindly. "No, Mr. Montreux. I think your brother was already dead the moment he noticed the shadow. He simply hadn't realized it yet." He paused, glancing once more at the desk and the single, fresh candle that burned too steadily for a room that had known panic. "And I intend to find out what or who it was that cast it." The house was silent, but in that moment I had the distinct impression that we were no longer alone in it. Not truly, not entirely. Something lingered, like breath just out of sight. And somewhere beneath us, in the quiet dark of the cellar, the first piece of the killer's trail waited. Holmes had seen its edge. It was now only a matter of drawing it out into the light. The cellar of Dunraven House was older than the house itself. Montreux explained as much as he led us down the narrow back stairwell, his voice echoing against the flagstone walls. The servants' stairs groaned beneath our boots, and the smell that met us was one of cold air, coal dust, and something faintly vegetal. Turnips or potatoes, perhaps, long since forgotten in the storage bins. A gas lantern bobbed in Hawtrey's hand ahead of us, casting erratic shadows on the damp stones as we descended. Holmes moved slowly, not due to hesitation, but calculation. His eyes traced the corners, the brickwork, the spidered iron piping along the ceiling. It was not merely a cellar to him. It was a neglected ledger of human activity, a half-written page with ink still drying. The moment we reached the earthen floor of the cellar, Holmes gestured for Hawtrey to stop. "No further," he said, and crouched low, examining the ground near the base of a rack of winter boots. The floor was not entirely soil, but packed with gravel and dust that had settled over the years into a surface just malleable enough to preserve recent disturbances. Holmes shifted the lantern slightly, and I saw them, faint impressions, boot prints. One set entering from the stair, then turning sharply toward the opposite wall, where a coal chute stood locked with a rusting latch. "There," Holmes murmured. "Boots placed and retrieved, but notice the gait. The step is uneven, left foot lighter than right. Not a housemaid and not Hawtrey. Tell me, Mr. Montreux, did your brother limp?" Montreux, frowning, shook his head. He was a horseman, proud of his stride. Holmes tapped the prints with his cane. "Then the person who wore these was not your brother, and yet they wore his boots." Hawtrey looked alarmed. "Sir, the boot rack is always kept tidy. I polish them every third day. But the set that's missing, it wasn't accounted for last week. I assumed the master had taken them." Holmes stood, dusting his knees. "An intruder, then. One with access to the cellar. One who wished to suggest that Montreux never left the study, while in truth—" He trailed off, glancing toward the locked chute. He may have entered that room already wearing the borrowed footwear. I felt the cold of the place rise deeper into my spine. "Holmes," I said carefully, "you don't suspect someone among the staff?" "I suspect whoever had a key," Holmes replied, "and whoever knew that the shadow would stretch westward at precisely 6:15. We returned to the drawing room, where Mrs. Bradmore and Elsie awaited us. The housekeeper was a stout woman in her 50s with a practiced composure, her black dress crisply starched and her silver hair arranged in the modest style of her station. Elsie, the scullery maid, was barely more than a girl, 19 at most, with a pale, fawn-like timidity. She would not meet Holmes's gaze. He began gently, yet with his usual precision. "Mrs. Bradmore, you have been employed here for 6 months." "Yes, sir. Came from the Wexley estate near Bury. Lady Wexley recommended me." "And in that time, how would you describe Mr. Benedict Montreux's habits?" She folded her hands. "Solitary, sir, but predictable. He rose at 7, had tea by 8, and retreated to the study by 10. Rarely took luncheon. Never dinner with the rest of us. He read most evenings. Never left the house after dusk." "Was he expecting any callers that evening?" She hesitated. "None that I knew of, sir. Though, Holmes leaned slightly forward. Yes? She glanced at Montreux, then lowered her voice. 3 nights before, I heard voices in the study. Not shouting, not loud, but someone else was speaking with him. Holmes raised his brows. Not you? No, sir. Not Hawtrey. She shook her head. He was with the firewood delivery, and Elsie, she glanced at the girl, was upstairs all evening. Holmes turned his attention to the maid. Elsie, he said softly, what did you hear? She looked up at him for the first time, and her eyes held that peculiar gleam of someone who has held something back too long. There was whistling, she said. Whistling? Yes, sir. Not like a tune. Just slow. 4 notes. Always the same. I've heard it twice now from the garden, after sundown. I thought it was just the wind at first, but it sounded wrong. Holmes stood very still. And did your master hear it? Elsie nodded. That last night? I heard him go to the window and open it. He called out, "Who's there?" Then nothing. Just silence. Holmes exhaled slowly and glanced at me. A whistle, a shadow, a door locked from the inside. Watson, you begin to see the shape forming. Barely, I admitted, but I see its edge. Holmes turned back to the others. That will be all for now. No one is to leave this house, and no visitors are to be admitted. I will return tomorrow with further questions. Montreux seemed startled. You're leaving already? Merely stepping back, Holmes said. Sometimes the best way to observe a shadow is to walk beside it rather than against it. As we stepped into the fog outside, he took my arm. Watson, we must visit the Ministry of Trade first thing in the morning. The Ministry, I said. What on earth for? Because, Holmes said grimly, someone sent Benedict a letter sealed with the Montreux family crest and burned it to hide the connection. The seal implies official weight, and there is only one type of correspondence that would have come from within a government building yet bear that mark. Classified? Worse, he said. Recalled. We walked on, past the lamplight and the silent carriages and the distant toll of St. Margaret's bell, and I could not help but feel, as I looked back at the tall, narrow windows of Dunraven House, that something inside had only just begun to stir. The shadow that had stretched across Benedict Montreux's life had not dispersed with death. It had merely moved on. The morning after our unsettling visit to Dunraven House was draped in grey. The fog clung low to the cobblestones, muffling the sound of carriage wheels and lending London the quiet of a city holding its breath. Holmes was already dressed when I descended to breakfast, his boots polished, his coat draped across the back of the armchair, and his gaze fixed on a single sheet of paper he held before the window. Without looking away, he spoke. Watson, you see here the official crest of the Ministry of Trade. Note the subtle watermark embedded beneath the ink. The seal itself is broken, but the impression was once whole. A missive from the Foreign Attaché's office, I believe. Late last night I cross-referenced the Montreux family's government entanglements in the Debrett's Almanac, and something curious emerged. I poured myself a cup of coffee and waited. Benedict Montreux was once attached as a civilian liaison to a special review panel of the Admiralty. Holmes continued. It was a quiet appointment, never publicly announced. He had access to a sensitive intelligence dossier regarding port infrastructure and overseas merchant activity, particularly in Constantinople. I blinked. That would explain the urgency of the burned letter. More than that, Watson, it suggests motive, political or personal, perhaps both. We departed shortly after for Whitehall, where the imposing facade of the Ministry of Trade loomed like a judgment above the fog. The clerks inside moved with the practiced disinterest of civil service, but Holmes's name still carried a peculiar weight. After a brief exchange of credentials and a cold stare from a man with wire-rimmed spectacles, we were admitted to the records annex. It was there we met a certain Mr. Percival Datchery, a pale, bird-like bureaucrat who seemed permanently in the act of peering over an invisible pair of half-moon spectacles. He led us to a narrow corridor, then opened a door marked Archives. Restricted. By appointment only. Holmes spoke directly. "We are here regarding any correspondence sent from this office to Mr. Benedict Montreux within the last 3 months, particularly sealed communications, official or otherwise." Datchery blanched, but maintained a brittle smile. "Such records would be beyond the scope of public review, Mr. Holmes." Holmes drew from his coat the sliver of charred parchment and laid it on the table like a playing card. "And yet," he said softly, "someone from your office saw fit to deliver such a document through unofficial means, and then ensured it was destroyed. Does that not fall within the scope of your concern?" There was a long silence. Datchery glanced at me, then at the paper, then back at Holmes. He sighed. 3 weeks ago, a private memo was issued to Mr. Montreux's residence. Marked urgent, yes, and sealed with his family crest, at his own insistence. He refused ordinary post after a security concern. What was the memo? A recall notice. It concerned an older file Montreux had retained, illegally, I must add, from his time with the Foreign Office. It related to an early draft of a shipping corridor proposal through the Bosphorus. Obsolete now, but it contained speculation about diplomatic vulnerabilities. Had the memo reached him? We received confirmation of delivery by hand. From a private courier, Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Whom?" Datchery hesitated. We don't know. The courier never signed the register. The porter said it was a tall man in a dark coat with a cravat too neat for a tradesman." "A description as good as useless," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. I leaned in. But if Montreux had received the document, why destroy it? Datchery spread his hands. Perhaps he panicked, or perhaps someone else destroyed it after killing him. Holmes stood, gently folding the charred fragment and tucking it away. "Mr. Datchery, you've been unexpectedly helpful. I advise you to check your remaining records for any other correspondence sent under the Montreux crest, and if I were you, I would double-lock your courier registry." Outside again, Holmes lit a cigarette and stood still in the drifting mist. "So," I said at length, "someone feared what Montreux knew or what he still possessed." "Precisely," Holmes replied, "and they sent a false courier to collect or confirm destruction of the document. Failing that, they silenced him." He tossed the cigarette into the gutter and looked eastward toward the river. We returned to Dunraven House. By the time we arrived once more at the Montreux residence, the sky had darkened with the threat of rain, and the air carried the metallic scent of water held in suspense. The windows of the study remained shut, but Mrs. Bradmore greeted us with the anxious eyes of someone who had been listening for footsteps on stairs that never came. Holmes wasted no time. "I need access to your pantry," he said. She blinked. "The pantry, sir?" "Yes. The corridor leading to it backs against the study's northern wall, does it not?" "Well, yes." "Instruct Hawtrey to open it." When we reached the pantry, Holmes examined the floor and the outer wall. After a moment, he removed a small metal implement from his pocket and began tapping along the stonework beside the spice racks. There was a dull thunk, then a sharper note. "Here," he said, "a cavity." He slipped a thin blade between 2 stones and pried gently. The panel gave way. Behind it was a narrow shaft, perhaps a foot wide, running behind the wall toward the study. Within, a twisted piece of copper tubing, hollow and curved like the mouth of a flute. "A speaking tube," Holmes said quietly. "Or a listening one," I replied. He nodded. "But its position is wrong for direct conversation. This was not installed for domestic use. It faces downward, toward the desk." Montreux, who had just arrived, stared at it in disbelief. "You mean someone could have heard everything he said?" Everything he read, or watched, Holmes said. From this very corridor, the mechanism is crude, but the principle is sound. The killer knew about it, perhaps even installed it long ago. When Montreux began showing signs of suspicion, when he heard the whistling, he likely searched in vain for a visible intruder, unaware that the shadow was not outside the window, but behind the very wall. I felt a chill coil in my chest. "And the whistle?" I asked. Holmes tapped the mouthpiece of the tube with his fingertip. 4 notes, carried through a pipe. A signal, or perhaps a warning. He turned to Montreux. "Did your brother ever serve abroad?" "Yes, a brief post in Smyrna. Why?" "There is a pattern to that whistle. 2 long, 1 short, then a final high tone. It matches a military signal used in Ottoman naval camps. I've heard it once before, in a barracks south of Izmir." Montreux's face paled. Then it wasn't a warning. It was recognition. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Indeed. There was a moment of silence between us, thick with implication. "I have one last request," Holmes said. "Bring me your brother's journals, every volume, particularly those dated between March and June of this year." I will." As Montreux turned to fetch them, Holmes stood quietly, listening to the rain as it finally broke against the glass above. "A man hides in shadows only when the light is behind him," he said, more to himself than to me. "And this man," I said slowly, "had already stepped into the study before sunset." Holmes nodded. "And what remains now is to discover whose footsteps he was walking in." The journals were brought to us in 2 bundles, their leather spines worn and corners scuffed from regular handling. Montreux set them on the desk with a reverence that bordered on dread. Holmes, ever methodical, began at once to sort them by date, his long fingers turning each page with the ease of a pianist searching for a forgotten chord. I sat nearby, watching the light from the study's window bleed weakly across the floor as the rain tapered to a grey drizzle. There was no sound but the rustle of paper and the occasional murmur from Holmes as he read. He moved with growing intensity through the entries, stopping often to mark a passage with the silver nib of his pen. "These are not the ramblings of a paranoid man," he said at last, handing me an open volume. "They are methodical observations, precise even as the fear begins to grow." I read the passage he indicated. April 19th. The shadow again. It comes just before sunset. Not a man, a shape. Stretches into the room even when the windows are closed. It is not following me. It is ahead of me. I believe I've seen it before. In the archives years ago. I dismissed it as a trick of the light. April 25th. Began rereading the Constantinople file. Redacted sections now strike me as deliberate misdirection. Someone ensured I looked at the wrong names. The real smuggler was never listed. But I remember his whistle. May 4th. 2 nights in a row. The same 4-note whistle. No footsteps, no knock. Just the notes and the shadow. As though someone is reminding me I'm not permitted to speak. I looked up at Holmes. He was trying to trace someone from his past, someone in the Foreign Office. A traitor? Holmes gave a slight nod. Or an informant. One who never made it into the official record. These notes suggest that Montreux uncovered a falsified archive. Someone went to considerable lengths to bury a name, perhaps even an entire identity. He picked up the next journal. This is where it becomes dangerous. May 12th. The books do not match. In the trade records, I found one vessel, Hecate, listed under 2 flags. One a Greek merchant registry, the other ours. Impossible unless sanctioned, which means my brother's signature was forged, or he was part of it. May 14th. I no longer believe Benedict was the only intended recipient of the recall notice. I believe I was bait. If I disappear, it will be explained away as madness. I must send something to Hugo, even if I do not trust him. Holmes tapped the edge of the journal. Do you see the subtle fracture, Watson? I frowned. You mean between the earlier clarity and this last entry? Number Y mean between intended action and execution. He writes that he must send something to Hugo, yet Hugo never received any such letter. The only note we possess is the one found in the volume of Gibbon, the one with the metaphor about the shadow. And you think that wasn't meant for Hugo? I think it was meant for us. He returned to the desk and opened the final journal. The entries had grown more erratic, some in ink, others in pencil. Several pages had been torn out entirely. Then Holmes stopped. Here. The handwriting was different, sharper, more angular. The phrasing no longer sounded like Benedict Montreux. May 19th. It has been done. The study is sealed. He never knew it was coming. All that remains is to watch the candle go out. The shadow arrived on time. Good God, I said. That's a confession. Holmes turned the page. The following entry resumed in Montreux's original hand. May 20th, found the study disturbed. Something has been moved. The book on Turkish shipping was not where I left it. I believe someone is entering through the house. I must place the last message in Gibbon. If they find the rest, so be it. But they will not find that. Holmes stared at the open page for several long moments. Then he looked up at Montreux. Has anyone else read these journals? Montreux shook his head. Only Hawtrey. He helped me carry them. Holmes shut the final book and stood. Then we must speak with Hawtrey again. Now. We found the butler in the hallway, polishing the banister with professional detachment. When Holmes called his name, he turned with the precision of a soldier. Hawtrey, Holmes said evenly. Were you in the house the evening of May 19th? I was, sir. Did you enter the study at any point? No, sir, not after the master retired. I heard him latch the door. Did anyone else handle the journals before this morning? No, sir, only myself and Master Hugo. Holmes stepped closer, lowering his voice. And yet one of the entries is not written by Benedict Montreux. There was a pause. Not long, but enough. Hawtrey's face did not change, but his right hand, still holding the cloth, tightened visibly. Sir, he said slowly, I do not know what you mean. Holmes gestured toward the staircase. Let us walk. There's a matter I wish to clarify in the service wing. They descended together. I made to follow, but Holmes flicked his fingers behind his back. A silent signal. I waited. 2 minutes passed. Then a sudden scuffle, a metallic clang, and Holmes's voice rose sharp and firm. Watson! I rushed down the narrow stair to find Holmes standing at the rear corridor, Hawtrey pinned by a fallen coal bin, his shoulder bleeding where it had scraped the edge. One of Holmes's boots held his wrist to the floor. He ran, Holmes said calmly, when I mentioned the forged entry. Attempted to reach the cellar. I knelt beside the man. You're hurt. Better than your record will be, Holmes said, standing upright. You see, Watson, Hawtrey has been loyal for many years, but not, I believe, to both brothers. Montreux had arrived behind me, breathless. What's happened? Your butler, Holmes said, has been working for someone else, someone who paid him to install the listening tube and destroy your brother's final letter. He copied that confession into the journal himself, hoping to frame Benedict as delusional. But why? Because Benedict had begun to suspect the involvement of someone in your father's circle, a man who used diplomatic shipping lanes to move stolen antiquities during the Smyrna years, camouflaged beneath official registries. Your brother discovered this too late, and Hawtrey was paid to monitor him. But when the signal came, that final whistle, the man himself entered. Montreux looked stunned. And you believe Hawtrey let him in? I believe he handed him the boots. Holmes crouched down and pulled something from Hawtrey's jacket pocket. A ring of keys, one small and copper-plated, identical to the cellar lock. Let Scotland Yard take him, Holmes said, standing. But the true killer still walks free. And who is it? I asked. Holmes turned toward the window. The light was fading once more. I suspect he is still in London, but not for long. We must act before the shadow returns, this time without a sunset to hide it. We returned to Baker Street under skies bruised with rain, the mist thickening into a fine, relentless drizzle that turned collars damp and made gaslight halos bloom around each street lamp. Holmes removed his coat without a word, shaking the moisture from its sleeves, and moved straight to his desk where he laid out the journals, the forged confession, and the scorched fragment of the Montreux seal. His hands were steady, precise, but I could see the current behind his eyes, an agitation of the intellect, electric and growing. I said nothing at first. The fire crackled faintly. Outside, a cab wheel hissed on wet stone. At last I broke the silence. Hawtrey will talk, surely. Holmes did not look up. Oh, he will. The evidence is too tight now. He will tell us who paid him, when the listening tube was installed, and perhaps how long he's been reporting back. Then we'll have our man, I said. Holmes paused in his sorting. Not quite. Hawtrey was an accomplice. Trusted, yes, but not trusted enough to carry out the murder. He was a watcher, Watson, a functionary. The killer needed him, silent, loyal, and in the dark. And the killer? Holmes looked up at me then, his face unreadable in the firelight. He is a man who understands misdirection, one who deals in ghosts, not specters of the supernatural, but those erased from record, from accountability. Shadows are his trade, Watson, and now he's made one fatal mistake. He crossed to the mantel and took down a single envelope. From it, he extracted a photograph, sepia-toned, frayed at the edges. I had Mycroft retrieve this from the old Foreign Office files, he said. It was taken in Smyrna in 1888. Here, look. I stepped beside him. The photograph showed a small group of men in colonial dress, most with mustaches and pith helmets, some in civilian coats. One figure stood just slightly apart from the rest. Younger than the others. Taller. His face was partially turned, his eyes shadowed by the angle of the sun. Who is he? I asked. Holmes tapped the margin. Listed only as a shipping attaché. No name, no designation, just an annotation. Temporary, cleared by Montreux. That's Benedict? Number Caermarthen, the elder Montreux brother, Hugo's father. Before he became Earl, it was he who vouched for the attaché, and it was that man whose trail vanished entirely within a year. No further records, no subsequent postings, nothing, as though he was swallowed. I felt a knot tightening. And you think he returned? That he's the one who sent the false courier and entered Dunraven House? I'm certain of it. The signal, the whistle, was not merely recognition. It was a code, a call across decades intended to freeze Benedict in place long enough for the killer to act. Holmes turned to the desk and withdrew another document. This is a port manifest, he said, from 3 months ago. The Hecate, still sailing, despite having been deregistered a decade prior. A phantom vessel. The signature approving the transit is falsified, but look, here, barely legible beneath the forgery, is the original. Benedict Montrose, he laid beside it the final journal entry, the authentic one. He knew. He'd found the Hecate, or rather, found that it had never been gone. And in doing so, he reopened a corridor to secrets someone spent half a career burying. And what do we do now? I asked quietly. Holmes's answer was immediate. We locate the man in the photograph, and we find out what name he wears now. We began the next morning at the Diogenes Club, a place where silence was sacrosanct and discretion enforced not by rules, but by bloodless tradition. Mycroft was waiting, seated as ever with his hands folded atop the Times, his expression caught between mild disdain and distant amusement. "My dear brother," he said as Holmes approached, "you appear damp and carrying too much paper." I require a list of all diplomatic officers posted under alias between 1885 and 1890, Holmes said by way of greeting. Specifically those attached to trade routes through the Bosphorus, and I require it now. Mycroft gave me a weary glance, then returned to his brother. You ask for classified material. Holmes lifted the photograph. I ask for justice. Mycroft's eyes narrowed. He took the photograph, studied it, and after a long pause said, I believe this man now calls himself Augustus Vale. Holmes stilled. The shipping magnate. Yes. Real name lost in a purge after Smyrna. Re-emerged with Turkish backing in Alexandria, then moved to Trieste under Austrian protection. Eventually acquired controlling interest in 3 British merchant firms under shell identities. His reputation is discreet, but his reach is extensive and dangerous. Holmes's voice was a whisper. Does he know I'm on his trail? Mycroft folded the newspaper with painful precision. If he doesn't now, he will by nightfall. We left the club in silence. By late afternoon, we were standing outside the carved iron gates of Vale's Kensington townhouse, a structure as elegant and silent as the man within. Holmes stood still for a long moment, his eyes tracing the building's windows, the spacing of the steps, the shadows cast by the high hedgerows. 2 guards within, he murmured, and a 3rd at the rear. They expect a visit, but not an invitation. Shall we go in, then? I asked. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, not yet. First, we give him a shadow of his own. He stepped into the nearest shop, a flower merchant, and returned with a single black tulip boxed in tissue. He wrote a short note, sealed it, and placed both into a parcel addressed to Mr. Augustus Vale, Esquire. The note read, The candle has been lit again. The shadow is walking backward now. Shall we speak before it catches up? S.H. We sent the parcel with a local errand boy and returned to Baker Street. Holmes paced. Every few minutes he returned to the window. Rain began again near 6. At precisely 6:45, a carriage halted outside our door. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered, gloved hands, immaculate cravat. Holmes smiled faintly. The man from the photograph, he said. Vale? Let us find out. The door opened. Mrs. Hudson showed him in with that particular chill she reserved for visitors whose smiles did not reach their eyes. Mr. Holmes, the man said smoothly, removing his gloves, your message was unexpected. Holmes gestured to the chair by the fire. As was your whistle. Vale's face did not change. He sat. I presume we are speaking in metaphor. No, Mr. Vale. We are speaking plainly. About your return to London. About a ship that doesn't exist, and a man you killed to keep it that way. Silence, then a faint smile. You have nothing that ties me to that house. Holmes opened a drawer and withdrew the copper listening tube. This was cut to length by a man with naval engineering knowledge. The signature on Hecate's false registry was copied using tracing technique taught in Smyrna's logistics school, and your voice was heard. 4 notes, always the same. Vale rose. You have nothing a court would accept. Holmes's voice was soft, but enough for a shadow to follow you the rest of your days. That's the thing about secrets, Mr. Vale. Once they step into the light, they leave a stain. Vale met his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and left without another word. The room felt colder when he was gone. Holmes sat at last. He'll run, he said. But we'll catch him? I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He leaned back and closed his eyes. We already have, Watson. All that remains is for the shadow to catch up. The following morning dawned without color. A pale, directionless light drifted through the curtains of Baker Street, and the city below moved with the sluggishness of a place unsure whether it had woken or merely turned over in its sleep. Holmes sat at the breakfast table, unmoved by the presence of food, his fingers steepled before him, eyes half-lidded but sharp beneath the veil of stillness. I'd seen that posture before, when the threads of a case, delicate and near invisible, had at last begun to weave into a shape only he could fully see. "You saw him for what he was, Holmes," I said quietly. "And yet you let him go." Holmes stirred. "I didn't let him go, Watson. I offered him a rope. Whether he uses it to pull himself free or hang himself, well, that's the business of men who live behind masks." "And what if he disappears before Scotland Yard can move?" "He won't," Holmes said simply. "He's too vain. Vale believes himself the only man still clever enough to vanish completely, which makes him the easiest sort to follow." He rose then, shrugged on his coat and took up his cane. "Come. I expect Lestrade will want something more than whispers and shadows before he risks reputation on a ghost from Smyrna." We arrived at Scotland Yard just past 10. The fog, persistent and strange, clung low to the embankment, and the air inside the yard was thick with tobacco and bureaucracy. Inspector Lestrade greeted us with the resigned suspicion of a man who had once arrested the wrong chimney sweep on Holmes's word and now trusted him completely without ever appearing to. "I've read your statement," Lestrade said, tapping the folder on his desk. "The butler's already confessed to tampering with the study and disposing of the original letter. Claims he never expected Montreux to die." Holmes nodded. "And yet the forged journal entry suggests otherwise." "I agree," Lestrade said, "which is why I've secured a warrant for Augustus Vale's movements, but we've no direct witness to place him at Dunraven House." Holmes handed him the photograph. "That man vanished in 1889. No passport, no death record. But he reappears in 1894 as Augustus Vale. Find the customs ledger for the Hecate's last known port, Trieste, and you'll find the import license under his name." Lestrade glanced at the image, then sighed. "You're asking me to prosecute a man for killing someone based on a whistle and a shipping form." "I'm asking you to watch him," Holmes said calmly. "Not pounce. There is one more knot to untangle. When it tightens, I will tell you when to pull." Lestrade leaned back. "You'd better be right." As we stepped back into the morning, Holmes turned not toward Baker Street but westward again, his strides long and deliberate. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To the cemetery," he said without pause. "The Montreux family plot." "What for?" "To look at a grave that shouldn't be there." We took a cab across town to Highgate, where the black railings were beaded with moisture and the trees hung their damp branches low over silent stones. Montreux had arranged a private funeral. Only a handful had attended. The caretaker pointed us toward the Montreux family enclosure, a quiet glade tucked beneath a yew. Holmes moved ahead of me, his gaze fixed. And then he stopped. There it was. A new stone. Simple, yet unmistakably Montreux in design. Etched in crisp, wet stone, Benedict Montreux, 1851 to 1894. He saw too much and spoke too little. Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver matchbox. With it, he struck a flame and held it to the base of the stone, watching how the light danced against the carving. "Fresh paint in the lettering," he murmured. "Only just set. Which means this was commissioned after the death. Someone wanted this grave to be seen, to be read." I looked closer. The inscription felt peculiar, not mourning, not even eulogizing. "Do you think Vale had it placed?" "Unlikely," Holmes said. "Vale wanted the memory buried. This is a signal." He knelt, brushing the wet moss from the base of the monument. There, just beneath the edge, carved so finely I nearly missed it, was a single word. Hecate. Holmes stood, brushing off his knees. "Then it's true," he said softly. "Benedict never destroyed the file. He hid it. Somewhere Vale wouldn't look. Somewhere tied to the vessel. The grave was a warning to us, left by someone who still wants the truth to surface. And who? I asked. Montreux himself? No, Holmes said, but someone close to him. Someone who knew the name Hecate still held weight. As we turned to go, the wind shifted and I thought I heard it again. The faint, almost imagined whistle. 4 notes, low and slow. Holmes turned sharply, but there was no one there. We returned to Dunraven House just after noon. The rain had finally ceased, and the gutters ran clear. Montreux greeted us in the parlor, weary but composed. "There's been a letter," he said, handing it to Holmes. "No, sender, but it was left in the study. Elsie found it under the blotter." Holmes opened it. The paper was unmarked, but the handwriting was familiar. Tight, slanted forward. "You're close now, but even shadows have layers. The Hecate's manifest is not in the house. It's beneath it. You'll need the key. Look where the candle would fall." Holmes said nothing, but his face darkened with sudden focus. He moved swiftly to the study, and we followed. He stood by the desk, then lowered himself slowly to one knee, positioning himself exactly where Benedict's chair would have been. The late afternoon light filtered in dimly from the west-facing windows. "There," he whispered. A long shadow stretched across the carpet, just as Benedict had described. Holmes traced the line with his cane until it touched the base of the far bookshelf. He knelt again, tapping lightly at the paneling. Then a sharp click. A hidden drawer, within, a small brass key and a folded map. Holmes opened it with care. It was an old blueprint of the house, the cellar, and beneath that, something older, a sealed sub-chamber, its access point hidden beneath the third wine rack. "Watson," Holmes said, rising, "get Lestrade." "Why?" "Because in the darkness beneath this house is the truth Vale tried to erase. If I'm not mistaken, it's still waiting in the crate where Benedict left it, dry, locked, and very much intact." He turned to Montreux. "And your brother, despite everything, managed to cast one final shadow before the sun went down." The descent into the sub-cellar began with the soft grind of stone against stone. Holmes had found the mechanism tucked behind a false beam, disguised as part of the wine rack's brass reinforcement. With a sharp twist and a shove, the rack itself gave way, swinging out on concealed hinges to reveal a narrow stair spiraling downward into damp, untouched dark. Lestrade, summoned swiftly by telegram and now lantern in hand, led the way with a wary tread, followed closely by Holmes, myself, and Montreux, whose silence had grown heavier with each step. The air thickened as we went lower. The scent of dust, iron, and old mildew pressed close against our faces, and the walls narrowed to bare stone that sweated from London's long winter breath. At the base of the stair, we found a vaulted chamber, sealed at one time but long since breached, perhaps by Benedict himself or by whoever had followed him. The brick was irregular and ancient, predating the house above by at least a century. Holmes moved ahead. The lantern's glow swept across the floor, revealing a series of wooden crates stacked with meticulous care along the far wall. Beside them, a single metal safe stood embedded in the stone, no larger than a traveling trunk, its corners darkened with rust, but the seal on its face unmistakably British, an old Admiralty emblem, half obscured but intact. Holmes knelt before it and held up the brass key we had, found in the study. It slid home with a reluctant click. Then came a soft groan of protest as the lock gave way, and the safe yawned open. Inside, protected beneath oilskin and cloth, lay a thick folder stamped "Classified, for office use only." Holmes lifted it, unwrapped it, and let the contents unfold on the stone table beside him. Lestrade leaned over it and swore under his breath. It was a complete manifest of cargo from the Hecate, dated, notarized, and signed not by Benedict Montreux, but by a falsified version of his name, the strokes and spacing subtly wrong. Alongside it were purchase orders, port clearances, and an unredacted summary of all items moved under the Special Corridor Agreement established in Smyrna over a decade ago. Ivory, stolen manuscripts, obscure relics marked religious artifacts, no inspection, and names, dozens of names. At the top of each document, in fine looping script, was a code name, Argent Sable. Lestrade stared. My God, this is not just contraband, it's espionage. Intelligence moved under diplomatic pretext. This would burn half the House of Lords if it surfaced publicly. Holmes nodded. Which is precisely why it hasn't. Until now. He turned to Montreux. Your brother found it. Not just the trail, but the crate. He brought it here, sealed it beneath the house, and wrote the shadow into his journal, knowing it would point us here eventually. Montreux's face was pale. Then Augustus Vale. He wasn't just protecting a smuggling ring. He was protecting a network, one tied to the crown. Lestrade took a long breath. We'll have to move carefully. I'll have this copied and secured at once, but the official story must remain discreet. Holmes stood, brushing dust from his knees. There is more to do, he said. Vale will know by now that we've struck something. He'll not wait quietly, and he will attempt to vanish again if we let him. Lestrade straightened. You've got a plan, haven't you? Holmes turned toward the stair. I always do. We returned to Baker Street just past 7. The rain had returned, slow and rhythmic. Holmes stood at the window for a long time, watching the fog shift along the rooftops like theater curtains rising over the final act. When he spoke, it was not to me, but to the room. Vale will not run in daylight. Too many eyes. He will wait for a shroud. I crossed to the hearth and set another log on the fire. Then we trap him beneath it. Holmes turned. Just so. The next morning, a short article appeared in the Times, tucked in the center pages where such things are overlooked by most. Recovered documents suggest misfiled archive error at Ministry. No further action required. There was no mention of smuggling, no mention of Benedict Montreux, no name that would stir public suspicion. But Holmes ensured a single phrase was printed in bold. The Hecate files were confirmed destroyed. By late afternoon, we had our response. A messenger arrived, young, breathless, coat damp from rain. No name, just a folded card addressed to S.H. Holmes opened it. His expression did not change. Meet me at dusk, beneath the first shadow where we last spoke. Bring no others, you understand. The card bore the faint impression of a watermark, a silver crescent and 3 letters, A.V. We were ready before sunset. Holmes dressed not in his usual overcoat, but in darker garb, plain and unassuming. I carried no pistol at his request, though Lestrade and 2 yard men waited a street over, poised for Holmes's signal. The meeting point was clear. Vale had chosen the one place he believed himself in control, his own residence in Kensington, the rear courtyard where his carriage pulled in, where the shadows lengthened first before the house blocked the rest of the light. It was the place Holmes had watched from days earlier, and now it would serve again, but this time for conclusion. We arrived 5 minutes early. Holmes stood alone in the courtyard, motionless. I waited beside the gate, hidden from view. The air was unnaturally still. Then a figure moved through the fog. Smooth, measured, a silhouette wrapped in tailored wool, the same figure who had sat in our parlor and spoken with serpentine confidence. Vale. He approached without hesitation. You're persistent, he said. Holmes offered no greeting. You killed a man to keep an empire of shadows intact. Vale smiled. He was going to speak. He already had, Holmes said. For a moment, silence fell between them. Then Vale stepped closer. Where is it? He asked. Holmes tilted his head. Gone. The crate. The papers. Everything. A flicker of doubt crossed Vale's face. Just a second, but it was enough. "I don't believe you," he said. "You believed you erased every trace," Holmes said. "But you left one thing behind." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the sliver of burnt parchment, the seal from the original letter. "This was your mistake. You tried to silence the man too late." Vale's eyes narrowed. "You should not have come alone." Holmes smiled thinly. "But I didn't." Two constables stepped into view from the alley. Lestrade followed, revolver drawn, eyes hard. Vale did not move. "You've no evidence that will hold," he said. Holmes stepped forward. "You're wrong. We have your voice. 4 notes, caught on the listening tube. Your boots, matched by impression and size. And your letters, recovered from the fireplace, bearing the same paper stock as the recall memo you falsified." Vale opened his mouth, but the words never came. Lestrade closed the distance. "Augustus Vale," he said, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, espionage, and the murder of Benedict Montreux." The rain had begun again, but for the first time in days it felt like the city exhaled. Holmes watched as Vale was led away, silent as ever, but this time without the mask of control. I stepped beside him. "You said he'd try to run." Holmes nodded. "And he did." He turned back toward the fog, but shadows always return to the places they began. The fog had not lifted by the following morning, but there was a softness to it now, as though the city, having surrendered one of its ghosts, had grown quieter in its breathing. The rattle of carriages sounded muffled, bells distant, the sprawl of London's rooftops hidden behind the gauze of early light. In our sitting room at Baker Street, Holmes sat at his usual place by the fire, pipe forgotten beside him, his gaze resting not on any one object but somewhere beyond the walls, beyond even the conclusion that had, at last, taken form. Lestrade had left earlier, the necessary paperwork tucked under one arm, the weight of an arrest not merely for murder, but for betrayal of the crown written in the tightness around his mouth. Augustus Vale, now unmasked, would not walk freely again. Yet Holmes, who had driven each piece into place with the precision of a surgeon, seemed distant from the triumph. He had spoken little after returning, and now he remained still, caught in a web of his own thoughts, unwinding one final thread Watson could not yet see. I turned from the window and set a pot of coffee beside him. "You've been quiet," I said. Holmes accepted the cup with a nod, but did not drink. "There are endings," he said, "that contain beginnings too small for most to notice." I waited, accustomed by now to his elliptical starts. "He came to us as a man trying to silence a mistake," Holmes continued. But Vale was not driven by fear of exposure. He was driven by fear of loss. Loss of control. Loss of the fiction he had built around himself for decades. The network was real, yes, but it wasn't just smuggling. It was erasure. He created shadows to live in them. He reached across to the desk and withdrew the final journal of Benedict Montreux, the one that had first hinted at the trail. His fingers paused on the last page. Benedict knew him, not just by name, but by shape. That's why he described the shadow arriving before him, not as metaphor, as recognition. "You believe they met again," I said. "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that Benedict invited him in, knowing full well he might die for it." He handed me the journal. Inside the back cover, tucked into a slit in the leather I had not noticed before, was a folded piece of paper, thin, brittle, but intact. I opened it carefully. One sentence, handwritten in the same precise script as Benedict's earliest entries. "Some truths must be buried twice, once beneath stone and once beneath silence." I looked up. This was never about exposure, was it? Holmes shook his head. Number 8 was about testimony. Benedict knew that if he shouted, no one would listen. But if he whispered it and left the echoes where they could be, followed, Someone might. The knock on the door came just after 11. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card on her tray. "It's for you, Mr. Holmes. The young gentleman insists he's expected." Holmes raised an eyebrow and took the card. It read, "Henry Altham, Royal Antiquities, Survey Office." "Ah," Holmes said, rising. "The name I'd been waiting for." He greeted the visitor himself, ushering him into the room with a flick of the hand. Altham was no more than 25, with ink-stained fingers and the nervous bearing of a man used to handling fragile documents and fragile egos in equal measure. "I received your note," he said to Holmes, "about the manuscript and the box." Holmes gestured to the desk, where the remaining items from the sub-cellar had been neatly arranged. Altham's eyes widened at once. "This can't be real," he said. "These pages, these seals, they were reported lost in a fire at Izmir decades ago. We have only summaries, fragments. This would change the historical record." Holmes folded his hands. "And yet it was used not for preservation, but for leverage. Tell me, Mr. Altham, do you know the name Argent Sable?" Altham paled. "Yes, it was a code phrase, an internal designation used when cataloguing stolen cultural items during the post-Ottoman restructuring. No one knew what it meant, just that it appeared on certain forms that were sealed from public view." "Vale knew," Holmes said. "He signed half of them." Altham looked up in stunned silence. "These are real," he whispered. "Then you know what must be done," Holmes said, quietly and with precision. "I'll see that they're preserved properly," Altham said. "Not buried again." Holmes nodded once. "Good. That is all Benedict would have asked." The young man left soon after, and the door closed softly behind him. For a while, we sat in quiet again, the fire popping gently. "You trust him?" I asked. "I trust his all," Holmes said. "It's harder to fake than guilt." Later that afternoon, Montreux arrived without a carriage or coat, as though he had walked a long way in thought before ever reaching our door. He looked older now, or perhaps simply revealed, stripped of the urgency and grief that had first brought him to us. He removed his gloves slowly, setting them on the arm of the chair like a man entering a room for confession. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "There's no need," Holmes replied. "There is," Montreux said. "You gave my brother his voice back. He died trying to leave a trail, and you made sure it was followed." Holmes gave a faint nod. "There's one thing I must ask," Montreux continued. "Vale, when he's tried, will the full details come to light?" Holmes met his gaze. "Not all. Not publicly. Too many threads touch too many corners. But enough. The murder, the falsified archive, the network. Vale will not walk free. Again." Montreux looked toward the window. "And the rest?" Holmes spoke carefully. "Will be preserved by those who know what they're holding." Montreux rose and extended a hand. Holmes took it. When he left, the light had begun to fade again. Another day giving way to another dusk, another stretch of shadow. Holmes lit his pipe and sat down across from me. "You never truly rest, do you?" I asked. He exhaled once through his nose. "There is always one more step, one more shadow. But tonight, Watson, we rest. Because somewhere, a man tried to speak before he was silenced, and now his words, though faint, have been heard." He leaned back, pipe glowing softly. And for the first time in days, I saw him let go of the case, not in forgetfulness, but in honor. As though the trail had ended not at an arrest, not at a headline, but in the quiet confirmation that the truth had been seen and would not be lost again. Outside, the lamplighters moved slowly through the mist, and inside, at Baker Street, the shadows settled into peace. The following week passed with the slow inevitability of a clock winding down. The city, as always, moved on. The streets of London resumed their rhythms, horse hooves on wet stone, market cries muffled by fog, the flickering wink of gaslight in narrow alleys. But beneath it all, there lingered the faint echo of what had been stirred into motion and then buried again with care. Holmes and I received no visitors in those days, though telegrams arrived. A brief note from Lestrade confirming Vale's transfer to a secure holding cell under special investigation. Another from Mycroft, terse, unreadable, acknowledging that the matter had been filed in the expected way. Holmes read these messages without comment, then returned to his monographs as though the case had evaporated. But I could tell it hadn't. He had carried it longer than most, carried it in silence, even as the facts lined up neatly in their boxes and the shadow of Vale was locked behind iron bars. On the fourth morning, a single envelope arrived. Creamy paper, no markings save for a seal pressed faintly into the wax. An owl perched on a broken column. Holmes paused mid-breakfast to open it. His eyes scanned the page once, twice. Then he folded it and placed it into the fire. I waited. He looked at me across the rim of his teacup. You recall the man from the survey office? Altham, I said. Eager, honest, a little pale around the eyes. Holmes nodded. He delivered the documents last night to a vault beneath the British Museum, with 2 archivists present and no copies made. I raised a brow. And the letter? Confirmation, no more than that. You burned it. It had done its work. He rose and paced slowly toward the window. Outside, the fog hung low again, but this time shot through with bands of clean light, as if the morning had broken open the gray. Watson, he said, do you believe in guilt that survives its host? I set down my fork. Explain. Benedict Montreux died before the law could help him, but he did not die in confusion. He understood what he had discovered. He feared it, yes, but he named it. He shaped it into a form that could be found. Holmes tapped the windowsill once. That is not cowardice. It is the last act of a man whose truth was denied until death. I stood, crossing to join him. You think he knew it would kill him? I think he chose to make his death the mechanism by which the truth was found. Holmes glanced toward the street below. There are some people whose integrity makes their silence ring louder than any testimony. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a small package. For you, Mr. Holmes. No return address. It came by hand. He accepted it and waited until she had left the room. Then he unwrapped it. Inside lay a single item, a silver pocket watch, tarnished, old, but intact. Its chain coiled in a neat spiral as though it had never been worn. Holmes opened the cover. Inside was no engraving, only a square of parchment, carefully folded. He removed it and held it to the light. I leaned closer. The message read, He used to wind it at dusk. Then he stopped. Now I will not forget. E. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he closed the watch and handed it to me. Elise, he said. The maid? She heard the whistle. She found the letter. And now she remembers the hour he feared most. He crossed to the fire, stood there a moment, then turned back. She is the one who heard what no one else noticed, the absence of ritual. A man does not stop winding a watch unless he no longer expects to see it run, and yet she watched over him until the end. Quietly. She gave this to you. She gave this to him. I was merely the messenger. It is a small rebellion, a private vow. He returned to his chair, the lines of his face softening at last. It is not justice in the public sense, he said, but it is something. That afternoon, we walked, first to the river, then across Westminster, neither of us speaking much. It was one of Holmes's quieter moods, when he became less a machine of logic and more a vessel for reflection. He walked slowly, with hands clasped behind his back, and I followed without prompting, content to let the silence unfold. Only when we reached Kensington again did he speak. "We solved the case, Watson," he said. "We did. But the cost of a truth," he continued, "is often the shape it leaves behind." I turned to him. "Do you regret it?" He stopped. "No," he said at last, "because the shadow no longer falls forward. It no longer drags another man toward silence. It has been cast, and it has stopped." We looked across the street where the Vale residence stood quiet now, its shutters closed, its gate chained. Whatever had lived there under another name was gone, its mask confiscated, its past reopened. Holmes drew in a breath, then turned back toward the path. "That is enough," he said. "For now." We returned to Baker Street as dusk settled once more across London. The lamps flickered on, one by one. The fog, for now, stayed back. Holmes resumed his chair, and I resumed mine. The fire crackled, and as the shadows rose around us, I could not help but feel that, for the first time in this case, they no longer led us toward the unknown, but toward a final, necessary peace. The last weeks of October passed in a curious state of stillness, as though the city itself were watching us from behind the glass of its fogged windows. The Vale affair had faded from headlines almost before it began, buried beneath the quiet machinations of Whitehall and sealed into rooms where neither light nor outrage were welcome guests. No trial would be held before the public. No scandal would be allowed to seep into the newsprint of the London morning. The world would continue unbothered by the details of what Holmes and I had seen. Yet that was never Holmes's goal. One evening, as we sat beneath the golden lamp of Baker Street and the wind-pressed autumn leaves against the panes, I took up the journal I'd begun when the case first arrived, a record not only of facts, but of moods, misdirections, and the stillness between events. Holmes had insisted, with unusual firmness, that I include every detail, the sound of the whistle, the shadow's stretch, the peculiar absence of powder burns, even the way Montreux's voice caught when describing his brother. He knew, as I had slowly come to realize, that the heart of this case was not merely deception, but erasure. And what had been taken must be rewritten, if not into public history, then into private truth. Holmes stirred from the fireside and spoke without preamble. "Vale has been relocated." "Relocated?" I echoed. "An overseas post, disguised again under a different name, courtesy of Mycroft's office." My brow furrowed. "So that's it? A man murders, manipulates, and disappears into the folds of empire?" Holmes's mouth curved into something too cold to be called a smile. "No, Watson. He's not been given sanctuary. He's been given a life sentence without bars, watched, contained, controlled, an exile of a different sort. Mycroft calls it administrative containment. I call it slow drowning." I frowned. "And Benedict Montreux?" Holmes stood, crossed the room, and placed a hand on the blackened case file that now sat locked in the drawer beside his desk. "He was not forgotten. Not by us. And not by the men who now walk with heavier silence in government hallways. His name has been placed, quietly, yes, but formally into the private record. A single annotation, deceased in service to the Crown via unacknowledged operation." "A footnote," I said bitterly. "A foundation," Holmes replied, "from which future shadows may be measured." The silence that followed was not empty. It was wakeful, complete. Later that week we returned, just once more, to Dunraven House. It had been closed and shuttered, the belongings catalogued, the journals sealed in Montreux's estate, yet the garden remained. The narrow path of wet stone, the single iron bench beneath the half-dead linden tree, and the study window, shuttered now, but still catching what little light crept past the thinning clouds. As we stood there, Holmes turned to me and said something I have never forgotten. "There are cases that test the intellect," he said, "and there are those that test the soul. This was the latter." And did we pass? I asked. He shook his head. We didn't need to. We only needed to bear witness. He stepped back from the house then, adjusted his scarf, and gave one final look to the shuttered window. It is enough, he said softly, and there will be others. We walked on into the gathering twilight, our footsteps leaving no mark on the path but sounding faintly in the damp air. As always, Holmes did not look back, and as always, I did. 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 I did.